Picture a man standing backstage at one of the biggest shows of his life. The sold-out stadium in his hometown, the city that made him, the crowd that waited years for this moment. And he is shaking. Not from excitement. He is in the grip of a depressive episode so severe that just weeks earlier, he had told an interviewer he spent 5 days in bed convinced he was waiting to die. That man is José Álvaro Osorio Balvin. The world knows him as J Balvin. And in December 2019, with 45,000 people filling the Estadio Atanasio Girardot in Medellín, Colombia, the psychological collision between his public persona and his private suffering became impossible to hide. Here is the paradox that nobody talked about clearly enough at the time. J Balvin was, by every external measure, at the peak of his life. His song Mi Gente with Willie William had become the first Spanish-language track to hit #1 on Spotify's Global Top 50 in 2017. A Beyoncé remix pushed it to #3 on the Billboard Hot 100. He was performing in front of sold-out arenas across 3 continents. And simultaneously, reportedly, he was so hollowed out by anxiety and depression that he didn't want to wake up in the morning. That gap between what the world saw and what was happening inside his nervous system is one of the most psychologically important stories in modern pop culture. And your brain, if you've ever smiled through your own pain, already understands it. Let's start with the neuroscience of what J Balvin was actually experiencing. Because understanding this changes how you see every high achiever who has ever told you they were fine when they clearly weren't. What Balvin described, the crying for no reason, the disconnection from his body, the 5 days in bed, the feeling of waiting to die, maps almost perfectly onto what the DSM-5 classifies as a major depressive episode. But the neurobiological dimension of this is what makes it so relevant to the psychology of performance and public life. Neuroscientist Helen Mayberg at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai has spent decades studying what she calls the default mode network in depressed patients. A set of brain regions including the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex that become hyperactive during depression. When this network is overactive, the brain essentially turns inward and loops on itself, replaying negative memories, running worst-case scenarios, generating a relentless internal monologue that clinical psychologists describe as ruminative thinking. J Balvin told Becky G on the En La Sala podcast in November 2020, "You lose hope and you feel strange at every place you go. You feel like you are outside of your body." That description of depersonalization, feeling outside your own body, is a documented symptom of severe anxiety and depression, and it is not metaphorical. It reflects measurable disruption in the brain's interoceptive processing, meaning the system that maps the body's internal state. Now here's what makes J Balvin's situation uniquely disturbing from a psychological standpoint, and why it matters for anyone who has ever had to perform, show up, lead, or simply function while quietly falling apart inside. Balvin had reportedly been struggling with anxiety since childhood. He said he had been shaking since I was a kid. But he wasn't diagnosed until approximately 7 years before his 2020 public disclosures, meaning somewhere around 2013. In the intervening years, he had built one of the most successful careers in Latin music history while carrying an undiagnosed and untreated psychiatric condition. Cognitive psychologists call this pattern high-functioning masking, the phenomenon where an individual with significant mental health challenges develops extraordinary compensatory strategies that allow them to perform at a high level externally, while the internal cost of that performance accumulates silently. I want to pause here and ask you something personal. Have you ever been in a room full of people, at work, at a family gathering, at a party, and felt completely invisible inside your own performance of being okay? That split between who you were presenting and who you actually were? Tell me about it in the comments, because I think this is far more common than any of us admit. And I think J Balvin's story is important precisely because it happened to someone the world assumed was immune to that kind of pain. For me, there was a period in my late 30s when I was functioning perfectly well by every external measure, meeting deadlines, showing up, being present, while internally running on something closer to fumes than fuel. I didn't have words for it then. Now I know those words. And I suspect some of you watching this do too. And stay with me, because by the end of this video, I'm going to show you the specific psychological mechanism that explains why J Balvin's public breakdown didn't destroy him. It rebuilt him. And that process has a name in neuroscience. In November 2019, as Balvin was preparing for his Medellin homecoming concert, violent protests erupted across Colombia against the government of President Iván Duque. Protests over corruption, police brutality, and economic austerity that left multiple people dead. And suddenly, J Balvin was not just a man preparing for the biggest show of his career. He was a man being publicly accused of silence, complicity, and indifference to the suffering of his own people. The social media pressure was immense, and it landed on a nervous system that was already, reportedly, operating at its absolute limit. What happened next is psychologically textbook in the most tragic way. Balvin went quiet on social media, which the public interpreted as apathy, when the Amazon documentary The Boy from Medellin, directed by Oscar-nominated filmmaker Matthew Heineman and released on Prime Video in May 2021, later revealed that he was actually in a state of psychological paralysis. He was captured on film speaking with his psychiatrist about his anxiety, scrolling through his feed, reading people's accusations, and struggling with what it means to be a public figure who carries both a personal crisis and a cultural responsibility simultaneously. This is what psychologists call a dual stressor event, when an internal psychological crisis and an external social crisis collide at the same moment, each amplifying the other's intensity. Here's what that does to the brain. Dr. Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University, one of the foremost researchers on stress neurobiology, demonstrated through decades of work that the brain under sustained stress undergoes measurable structural changes, particularly in the hippocampus, the region most associated with memory, emotional regulation, and contextual processing. Chronic stress, McEwen showed, actually causes the hippocampus to shrink. It reduces the brain's capacity to contextualize threatening information, meaning that under sustained pressure, the threat feels bigger, more permanent, and more inescapable than it actually is. For J Balvin in late 2019, that neurobiological reality meant that the public criticism wasn't just painful, it was likely neurologically experienced as catastrophic. And yet, this is the part that makes the psychology of J Balvin's story genuinely remarkable. He went on stage in Medellin. He performed. And during the concert, he stopped the show, spoke openly about the protests, asked the crowd for a moment of silence for those who had died, and addressed President Duque's policies directly. That moment, witnessed by 45,000 people and captured on film, is what researchers who study post-traumatic growth at the University of North Carolina Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun, whose work established the concept in the 1990s, would describe as a crucible moment, a point at which the pressure of a crisis becomes the very catalyst for psychological transformation. Post-traumatic growth, it's worth clarifying, is not the same as resilience. Resilience is bouncing back to where you were. Post-traumatic growth is being permanently changed in specific, measurable ways by the experience of having survived something that threatened to break you. Tedeschi and Calhoun identified 5 domains in which this growth tends to manifest: new possibilities, relating to others, personal strength, spiritual change, and appreciation for life. J. Balvin's subsequent behavior maps onto at least 3 of these. He began publicly advocating for mental health with a specificity and consistency that went beyond celebrity disclosure. He told People magazine in 2020, "Because I am an artist who has had success, no one thinks I could ever have anxiety. And also, because I am Latino, many Latino men will not want to talk about depression because they fear it is not a manly thing." He named the cultural barrier directly. He told Today that he is medicated and said, "I gotta take it in a humble way and just accept that I need the chemicals to balance my chemicals." That last sentence, said publicly by one of the most decorated Latin artists of his generation, is, in the context of machismo culture and the persistent stigma around psychiatric medication in Latino communities, a genuinely radical act. And neuroscience tells us why it matters beyond symbolism. Research on what psychologists call social contagion of disclosure, studied extensively by James Pennebaker at the University of Texas at Austin, shows that when a high-status individual publicly discloses a stigmatized personal experience, it measurably lowers the psychological barrier to disclosure for others in the same cultural group. Camila Cabello confirmed this directly. She wrote in Time's 100 Most Influential People of 2020 that seeing J Balvin's Instagram posts about his depression during her own period of severe anxiety made her, and I'm paraphrasing, feel less alone in a way that changed something in her. What J Balvin's story tells us, through the neuroscience of depression, through the psychology of high-functioning masking, through the documented reality of post-traumatic growth, is something that your brain already suspects, but may not yet have full permission to believe. That breaking down in public, when it happens honestly and without performance, can become one of the most powerful things a person does. Not because suffering is noble, but because shame cannot survive visibility. And the brain, given the right conditions, is genuinely capable of turning the worst thing that ever happened to it into the most meaningful. And before you go, I want you to type one word in the comments. One word for that feeling of finally admitting you weren't okay and discovering the world didn't end when you did. The word is real. Type it below. Because if any part of J Balvin's story lives in you, you deserve to say so.